Based on my experience of a few decades working in the world of IT, I've discovered that users like two basic things. Number one, they like things to work, and secondly, they like them to work fairly quickly. And if we have a user like Bob that wants to access some internet resource and that traffic is going from his PC through the firewall out to the internet, if we have a security policy that is 1,000 lines long on this security appliance, as Bob's initial traffic shows up at that gateway, the firewall is going to start going through those rules, looking at line number one, rule one. Does it match? Yes or no? If it doesn't match, goes to rule number two. Does it match? Yes or no? And continues that process. And Bob's match isn't to like rule number 900. That could be a lot of utilization here on the gateway. It also could cause a little bit of a delay for Bob as the gateway is doing that check. So a solution that Checkpoint has is to use the concept of an inline layer. And a good analogy to understand inline layers is the concept of a restaurant and a menu. If you and I are going into a restaurant and we want to enjoy a nice meal, if we have some dietary restrictions, there's possibly a separate menu just for that, or maybe a portion of the menu that focuses on catering to those needs. And in that example, if a certain portion is catering to the needs of what we can eat, we don't really need to pay attention to all the rest of the menu. We can just focus on the part or pieces of that menu that apply to us. And with inline layers, here's how it works. We have parent rules, which identify general traffic patterns. For example, any traffic coming from the inside network or from the inside zone going to the outside. So maybe that parent rule is called in to out. And then subsequently, we have child rules with all the nitty-gritty details of what we want to either permit or restrict based on that flow of in to out. And if we had a server on our demilitarized zone, on our DMZ, we're going to have some other rules regarding traffic coming in from the internet going to our DMZ. So maybe we call that parent rule from outside to DMZ. And then we have our individual child rules under that parent that specify the nitty-gritty details of what we want to either permit or deny as part of that traffic flow. And here's why the inline layers are so helpful to the firewall. If there's traffic, let's imagine we have Lois out on the internet who is trying to access one of our DMZ servers. Well, as the firewall considers that packet that comes in, as it looks at the parent rule of in to out, it's going to say, nope, this isn't going from the inside to the outside. And it can skip rule number one and all of rule one's children. It doesn't need to process all of them. So if there's 15 or 20 or 100 child rules under rule number one, none of those have to be considered because there's no match at the parent, so it can ignore all the children. So in the case of Lois going from the outside to the DMZ, it would go to rule two, it would match on that, and as a result, the firewall can then individually process the child rules. And that, my friend, is an awesome feature. Another sweet feature about these child rules, these inline layers that we can add, we can also configure them to be reusable. So if we have certain sets of traffic that we want to allow or deny at various parts of our policies, we can reuse those. So we can create an inline layer once and then reuse it at multiple points in our policy. Another benefit is that we can assign administrative controls and privileges. So as we have multiple administrators, if we want to give full rights to some administrators regarding inline layers or restrict rights to others, we can do so regarding the individual inline layers. And that's also very useful when you have multiple administrators who are working in the system. And speaking of administrators, sometimes it's tricky to find the correct entries or lines that we're looking for inside a security policy. So having the inline layers with the parent rules, that does help with organization as well. But we also have another feature called section titles that we can just add. And those section titles, we could name them with meaningful names, such as management traffic section or user traffic section. And then in Smart Console, we could go ahead and jump right to those sections to make it easier to find them and work with them. So here's an example of using sections. They are in yellow. So if we use this option right here to collapse all sections, it's just going to show us these sections. Then we can expand those sections, and it's going to show us the rules in each of those sections. Another thing that is also demonstrated right here in this example are inline layers. If we take a look at rule number one, this is a parent rule called CP management. And on this rule number one, it's matching for any traffic source from the management PC or the management server if it's going to either firewall 1 or firewall 2, regardless of protocol or service. And the action, instead of saying deny or accept, it's referring to an inline layer. So there's an inline layer that's being used with all the individual child rules associated with this parent rule. And if we expand the rule, just by clicking on the expand feature right here, this is now showing us 1.1, 1.2, 1.3, the individual rules as part of this inline layer that we're using. And rule number two has an inline layer as well. If we expand that, here it's showing us the rules inside of that inline layer. So let's consider the user Bob, who's on a normal PC, not our admin PC, who's going out to the internet. The first rule to be consulted on the firewall would be rule number one, process from top to bottom. And the firewall would say, well, the source address isn't the management PC, the source address is not the management server, and as a result, rule number 1 is not going to match, and as a result, it's not going to consider any of the child rules. Instead, it'll go on to rule number 2. And the firewall will ask, does the traffic match rule number 2? Inside to outside, any? And if Bob's traffic is going through those two interfaces from inside to outside, it's going to use this inline layer called users going out, which includes rule 2.1, 2.2, and 2.3. So those child rules would then be checked in order, looking for a match. In this nugget, we've taken a look at how we could use section titles for organizational purposes, as well as inline layers that not only help with organization, but also help to optimize the processing on the firewall as it's going through its rules. I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.